Hello, and welcome to Unscripted English. I'm Kit.
And I'm Lawton. Nice to be with you guys again. Welcome to the second episode of Unscripted English. We are happy to be joining you again today. And today we have, I think, a very interesting topic that as English language learners, I think many of you will be interested in. Kit, do you want to introduce the topic?
Yeah, so today we are talking about personal pronouns. And you might be thinking, personal pronouns, that's one of the first things that we learn in English. You said you're not catering towards beginners. Why are we talking about personal pronouns? And we're talking about personal pronouns because if you are aware of a lot of, Western culture and discussions going on right now, you might have heard about them before. But if not, you might have no idea. And that is because there is a movement these days to be a bit more mindful about what sort of pronouns we use towards people. And a lot of people are choosing new pronouns that you might not be familiar with. So I wanted to do a talk about that. So I guess for this episode, Lawton's just going to give us a quick reminder of what a pronoun is and what a personal pronoun is, your basic stuff. And then I'm going to lead a discussion on how we're using personal pronouns now, how discussions around them are changing, and what sort of new pronouns you might hear. So, Lawton, do you want to start us off?
Sure. Yeah, I'll just give, like Kit said, a very quick rundown of the pronouns that we use in English and just some standard usages. And then I'll pass back over to Kit. So, of course, the pronouns in English, as I'm sure you're all aware, are I, you, he, she, it, we, and they. One interesting usage of you in English that I think some non-native speakers do struggle with a little bit is that in English we have a usage of the word you that is called the generic you. And this is when in a conversation you use the pronoun you, but it doesn't mean you, literally the person you're speaking to. It means kind of people in general. So we often use you when talking in generalities like that. So just to give a very basic example, you might say something like, if you want to get in shape, you might want to start exercising. So in that sentence, I used you a couple of times, and it's never really meant to address the listener directly necessarily. It's more kind of general advice, and so the you is really just meant to be anybody. So that's a very common usage of the word you in English that I think speakers of some languages that don't have the generic you may struggle with from time to time. But other than that, I think everybody who is listening to this podcast or watching this video is going to already have a pretty strong grasp of the pronouns in English. So I will go ahead and pass it back over to Kit. So yeah, Kit, why don't you tell us more about how pronouns are being used today in a way that is maybe different than they have been used in the past?
Thanks, Lawton. So there's something in English that you might hear more often these days that you probably haven't learned in class, and that is the question, what are your pronouns? And for some people that might be a bit confusing. Even a lot of native English speakers might get a bit confused that someone's even asking that. They might be like, what do you mean? And so the reason why we're beginning to ask that question a lot more is because in English, personal pronouns are used depending on the gender identity of the person that they reference. So generally, we're taught when you're talking about someone who is female, you refer to that person as she, her. When you're talking to someone who's male, you say he, him. Or if you're talking about more than one person, you use they, them. Now, the problem with this is that not everyone simply identifies as male or female, right? You might not feel like a man or a woman. And so for those people might choose to use a different pronoun, right? And then even for people who do identify who is a man or is a woman, there are cases, our markers of gender, how we show our gender identity and expression, it's different from person to person. It's different in different countries and culturally. And so this means that sometimes it might be hard to necessarily look at someone and think immediately know what pronouns they might prefer and how they identify, if they sort of have a different mix of ways that they are presenting that you're not sure exactly what they prefer, right? So that might be a little confusing and complicated to talk about, but let's talk about it simply with some examples. So, for example, Lawton, what are your pronouns?
Yeah, so I do use the he, him pronouns, as somebody might guess looking at me. Kit, what about you?
So me, I use they, them pronouns. And that's sort of why I wanted to tackle this topic really early in our podcast, just so that our listeners know that I prefer to use they, them pronouns, and I prefer more gender-neutral language to describe myself in general. I identify not as a man or as a woman, but I identify as non-binary is the term.
Yeah, non-binary. That's, I think, a very useful word to know when talking about, for this discussion, when talking about identity. So I should say, as a co-host and a very close friend of Kit, that I will definitely be doing my best to always use they, them pronouns, but I do want to go ahead and apologize in advance if I ever do use the wrong pronouns. That is definitely not intentional, and I invite Kit to correct me, and I will, happily take that correction and correct myself. But just in case I happen to use them incorrectly, please let me know.
I will. Thank you, Lawton. And part of the reason that is sort of tricky is obviously, number one, because a lot of people would look at me, my face, my hair, and think like, oh, that's a girl, and refer to me as she, her. So I'm aware that the way I look sort of looks a certain way, right? Differently than how I might present. And so that's why I try to be conscious of telling people that actually know I'm non-binary and I use they, them pronouns. And also it is relatively new. I haven't used they, them pronouns for my entire life. It's something that has really only become a more viable option in the past several years, I would say. And so when I first met Lawton, I was not using they, them pronouns. I had never met anyone who used they, them pronouns or heard of anyone who did that. I didn't know it was an option, right? I felt very stuck. So even just in the time I've known Lawton, I've sort of been able to learn more about myself and my identity and tell people how I want to be talked about. So again, yeah, a lot of people like Lawton as well who knew me before I used they, them pronouns are in the habit of using she, her. So that's why you might hear people mix it up sometimes too. If any of our listeners have any questions like that, I'm happy to answer in the comments. But getting back to sort of the pronoun bit and how we talk about the pronouns, the big thing that I hear, and I think a lot of people hear most often when they hear they, them pronouns referring to one person is that, well, isn't that grammatically incorrect? And I think we think that, right, because in school, excuse me, in school and probably in your English classes, that's what you're taught, right? Is if it's one person, you use she or him. If it's multiple people, you use they, them. But in actual spoken English, in actual practice, that's not always the case. And to give you an example, say that Lawton and I are with a group of friends hanging out at a cafe. Lawton leaves and I see his phone on the table, so I say to one of our other friends, oh, look, Lawton forgot his phone, right? I say his because I know it's Lawton's. In a different scenario, maybe a couple of our friends get up to go someplace and it's just me and Lawton and I see a phone on the table, but I don't know whose phone it is. In that case, I might say, oh, look, someone forgot their phone. And that's a very common use case of there, where I'm talking about one singular person, but I don't know this person's gender. I don't know which of our friends forgot their phone, but I know one friend did. So it is still a bit more unusual to hear it when you're talking about one person who you know that person. But because there is such a large use case for using they, them to refer to one singular person, I think that's why a lot of non-binary people have really embraced the pronouns they, them, and that's why I like them as well. It's a little awkward maybe at first for people to get used to, but once you get used to it, it's pretty seamless and it sounds pretty natural because it's already used in English that way.
Yes, right, exactly. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about neopronouns? That's something that I have to say that I am almost entirely unfamiliar with, if I'm honest. So maybe you can give us some information on it, and then, yeah, I might have some questions for you.
Sure. So, neopronouns basically, not all non-binary people use they, them pronouns. So some people choose different pronouns. They just want to make up a completely new pronoun instead of using she, he, or they, right? And I have to say, and these are called neopronouns, and I have to say that I am also not an expert on neopronouns. I personally do not use them, and I don't know personally very many other people who do, but I know that there are people who do. So some of I think the most famous examples of neopronouns that I have heard are zim or zer.
Okay.
That's either with an X at the beginning or with a Z at the beginning. It just sort of depends on the person. I think they're pronounced the same though, the X and the Z.
Okay.
And so basically you would use those the same way you would use any other pronoun. So for example, with the phone, oh look, Kai forgot their phone is how you would use that instead.
Very interesting.
Yeah. And again, there are other examples as well. I'm not an expert on neopronouns, but Lawton, did you have any other questions about those that maybe I can answer?
Well, I think one question that our viewers might have is along the lines of like, hey, I'm just a language learner here. How can I keep track of all of these pronouns? I thought this was an easy part of the language that I already had down. Now you guys are telling me to use they, them for individual people, and there's these neopronoun things that you guys don't even know that much about. Like, what can I do here? What should I do? What would you say to that, kid?
I would say, first of all, not to stress about it too much. Like I said, it's perfectly acceptable these days to, if you're not sure what pronoun someone uses, to ask, what are your pronouns, right? And so that's a very easy way then to just know, okay, this person uses these pronouns, and you can sort of practice yourself. And if you mess up, generally people are going to be nice about it. I've never met anyone who got super upset about people mixing up pronouns. I personally don't get offended either. I know that it is tricky to get the hang of. And so if you're uncertain, first of all, just ask the person you're talking to. And I'd say secondly, too, as a non-native English speaker, I think a lot of people know that not all different languages even have gendered pronouns. Korean, for example, is a language where there is no way, you don't really ever say he or her in any way.
Yeah, I guess technically you have "그" and "그녀," but you would never say that in spoken language. I think you do see it written sometimes, but yeah, for sure, you don't have commonly used pronouns in the way that we have them in English and most Germanic and Romance languages.
Right. So, I mean, if you're one of those language speakers too, who, where your language doesn't even use any gendered pronouns, and even he and she might get mixed up in different scenarios, again, I think a lot of times people are going to be understanding of that you're a non-native English speaker, and that it just takes practice to get used to.
Absolutely. And for any listeners who maybe are themselves non-binary and who are looking for some additional resources in English, we will try to include some links and some references to potentially some other YouTube channels where non-binary individuals are talking about their life and the way they identify. Because, yeah, I think that it's important to be able to find your community. So, we definitely want to be providing those types of resources to any of our listeners, who are themselves non-binary or in any way, not conforming with a typical concept of gender.
Yes. And I think that's one of our core values in this too. Lawton and I, we know we're going to get a wide range of different people from different cultures and different backgrounds. And we really want this to be a space of learning and a space that is welcoming. So, don't...
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
No matter what, I want to say you're safe here with us.
Yes.
We will do our best ourselves to understand, and we hope that you do the same to us.
Yes, I think as a channel, we will probably refrain from diving too deeply into most political issues. We don't want to necessarily make this a political channel. However, I think that for both of us, as Kit said, it's critical that we are accepting of people from all different identities and walks of life, and we want all of our listeners here to feel safe, and that is something that we will definitely stand for and stand behind. So yeah, we hope that you do.
So maybe just to wrap up, I think we did a good job of kind of asking questions sort of in the middle as they came up. But was there anything else that you wanted to talk about or wanted to ask, Lawton, before we wrap it up?
I think we covered most of my questions, actually. I think that, if any of our listeners have questions, then please feel free to leave those in the comments. We would be happy to respond as best as we can. Kit probably would be the better one to respond in this case. But yeah, we're always happy to respond to questions. And yeah, we can always do a follow-up episode in the future to dive into it a little bit more deeply. And I think it would be interesting to hear more about your experience, Kit, being a non-binary person living as an expat. That's a very, specific life experience to have. So I think that would be interesting for us to dive into some more in the future.
Absolutely. So Leave us your questions and let us know what else you'd be interested in hearing us talk about. And thanks for joining us on this second episode.
Yeah, thanks so much, everybody. We will see you again soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.